As I make this program, there are more reports again of a missile attack, a big missile attack by the Russians on Ukraine. Many missiles launched from all sorts of places, but apparently some of them from around the Arctic by Tupolev 95 bombers, striking Ukraine, a rather complex missile strike involving many different types of weapons, ballistic missiles, who knows what sort, cruise missiles launched from these bombers, drones, all hitting various targets in Ukraine. I'm not going to discuss in detail, or indeed further in this program, that particular missile strike, which is, as I said, still ongoing. I'm going to do what I always do. I'm going to wait a day until the dust has settled, metaphorically speaking, of course, and try to assess what actual purpose and this missile strike served, and what actual damage it's done. It's at the moment, I think, impossible to give any kind of even provisional assessment. Anyway, let's turn to the other events that are happening on the battlefields. And I'm going to say, first of all, that yesterday, buried in all the stories about tank transfers, the Ukrainians did the classic thing. They buried bad news using good news. Their media was full of reports about the tank transfers. We saw photos of Zelensky's face lighting up when he heard about the tank transfers, all of that sort of thing. But in the midst of all the discussions, we've now had information slipping out from the Ukrainians, confirmation, finally, that the town of Vuhledar has indeed been captured by the Russians. We're told that the Ukrainian forces withdrew from Vuhledar in good order to pre-prepared defense lines. There's no word as to when exactly this orderly withdrawal took place, and in fact, as we know, Vuhledar has in reality been under Russian control for around 2 weeks, 2 weeks before this announcement was made. Well, the Ukrainians are not the only people to bury bad news under a weight of good news, and perhaps one shouldn't be too critical, but this is a war, and a lot of Ukrainians have been given the impression that Vuhledar is still being defended, including, no doubt, families of soldiers who have been fighting in Vuhledar. And the fact is that these claims, or pretended claims, over the last 2 weeks, that Vuhledar was still in Ukrainian hands, were simply untrue. Now, there's not been a huge amount of further news from Bakhmut over the last few hours, though all the indications are that the fighting there is still continuing. There's some suggestions that the Ukrainians are becoming increasingly worried about the position, not just of Seversk to the north of Bakhmut, which is now coming under increasing pressure from the Russians, but also of another town to the west of Bakhmut, which is Chasov Yar. And the Russians moving methodically to cut the roads from Chasov Yar to Bakhmut. These are roads that are to, enter Bakhmut from the west. I've discussed already the fighting in Ivanovka, or Krasnoye, as the Russians call it, which is this village to the west of Bakhmut, which sits astride that road, and the fact that it does seem that there's some kind of northern spur of a road that enters Bakhmut from Chasov Yar, and that road is apparently also now being threatened through the Russian attacks on Krasnaya Gora and Paraskovia, whatever, the other village whose name I'm sorry to say, and I apologize for this, I have great difficulty pronouncing. I do eventually get there with these names, but for the moment I haven't got there with this particular one. But anyway, there are apparently increasing concerns amongst Ukrainian officials that the Russians are also aiming to capture Chasov Yar, which is, as I said, to the west of Bakhmut. And obviously, if they did that, that would bring the situation in Bakhmut to critical levels. But if the Russians do take such a step, then I think it also would suggest that they are indeed thinking of doing that which I have discussed in recent programs, which is not just try to invest and capture Bakhmut itself, but perhaps encircle and destroy all the other Ukrainian troops, this large concentration of Ukrainian troops that are near Bakhmut and which are trying to defend this town and supporting the Ukrainian soldiers who are actually fighting inside the town itself. And, well, perhaps the Ukrainians do have that worry. I don't know what they're going to do about it. For the moment, as I said previously, there is no sign, despite all the talk about mobile defense that's coming from the United States, that the Ukrainians are taking any such step. The defense lines, Ukrainians continue to preserve their positions in the existing defense lines in Bakhmut, in Seversk, in Chasov Yar for that matter. They show no sign of retreating from them, and the fighting remains extremely bitter. Incidentally, and on the subject of exactly how many Ukrainian troops there are in this area, I saw a Russian report which mentioned in passing that there are 30,000 Ukrainian troops near Bakhmut. Now, that isn't the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut itself. We don't know how many there are of those, but perhaps a crude guess might be around 8,000 if it's 2 brigades or plus all the supplemental troops that come with that. These brigades get rotated all the time, and as I said, as we said many times, they suffer heavy losses. But my understanding is that this refers to the forces, the Ukrainian forces outside Bakhmut, those 27 brigades that Bernhard, that the Moon of Alabama counted, the 34 brigades that were counted by Big Serge, that the actual number of troops is around 30,000. Now, that obviously is far below some of the estimates that others have floated. I think Bernhard said at one point that if all of these units were up to strength, that would make for a force of around 97,000 men. I have to say, I think 30,000 is a much more plausible figure. And by the way, if it's true, and this did come from a Russian source, so take it with, a great deal of caution, but why would the Russians want to understate the number of Ukrainian troops around Bakhmut? But anyway, take it with caution, it is from a Russian source. If it is 30,000, then it tells us something else, which is that Ukrainian brigades on the front lines are very understrength now. They don't come anywhere close to the typical numbers of 3,000 to 4,000 men. 1,000 or less is the number of troops in a particular brigade on the front lines, which is perhaps a further indication of the sheer scale of losses which Ukraine is experiencing. Anyway, all of this is all I'm going to say about Bakhmut today. As I said, fighting goes on there. The reason why we're not getting so many reports from Bakhmut, which, to be clear, I think still remains the big battle at the moment, is because there have been some really dramatic developments elsewhere on the front lines in southern Donetsk region, and that is in Vuhledar. Now, Vuhledar is this town. It's a relatively small place in southern Donetsk region. It's also very connected, by the way, to Zaporozhye region. There was a lot of fighting there back in November, nearby. The Russians have tried to capture it several times over the course of this war. It's apparently a difficult place to capture. It's on slightly elevated ground. It's got a lot of high buildings, and whenever the Russians have tried to capture it, up to this point, they've been pushed back. Well, over the last couple of days, as I've discussed on this channel, the Russians have been launching some kind of offensive on the southern front in Zaporozhye region, along the Dnieper River, a bit further east, around a town called Orechov, further east still, around Yulia Polye. But there's also been an attack, a significant Russian attack on Vuhledar. And we're now getting reports that this attack in Vuhledar is being pressed home very intensely, and that the Russians are making significant progress in and around Vuhledar. And I'm going to read a flurry of reports from the official Russian TASS news agency. First of all, there's a report from Igor Kimakovsky, who told Russian television on Thursday, that's to say today, earlier today, that Russian troops have entered and got entrenched on the outskirts of Vuhledar, thereby blocking the adversary's forces. Our artillery is attacking the enemy, who is trying to counterattack. And according to Kimakovsky, this is from TASS now, currently the main task of the Russian forces is not attacking Vuhledar head on, but enveloping it in a pincer movement, as it was successfully done in the vicinity of Soledar, and as is being done now in the vicinity of Artyomovsk. Artyomovsk is, of course, Bakhmut. Artyomovsk is the Russian name for Bakhmut. And Kimakovsky went on to say this strategy has worked very well indeed. And in other words, that the Russians, rather than trying to storm Vuhledar, though they have apparently actually entered the town itself. There's reports, by the way, that they captured a belt of dachas. These are small country cottages that are very common in this part of the world, that form part of the urban community of Vuhledar, but they seem to be moving into the more high-rise apartment buildings, the areas of the more high-rise apartment buildings that make up Vuhledar itself. But the main priority is that Vuhledar, as I said, is gradually being surrounded. At least that's what this person, Kimakovsky, is telling us is the Russian plan. So that was from Kimakovsky. And then we've had another commentary from another Russian official. This is Yan Gagin, who is an advisor to Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic. And he talks about the kind of fortifications that the Ukrainians have constructed in Vuhledar. He says that the city has similar underground infrastructure. There are quite a few mines with interconnected underground infrastructure, which will complicate the assault approximately the same way as it was in Mariupol and Soledar. And lastly, we've had yet another report, again from Gagin, but this is another report from TASS. And Gagin explains the importance of Vuhledar. He says that Vuhledar is in the Donetsk area. Avdiivka and Marinka are near. Once control of Vuhledar has been established, the delivery of ammunition to the Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka and Marinka will be disrupted. It is from there that the strikes at Donetsk city are carried out. Also, flank and frontal strikes on Ukrainian forces will be possible. And Gagin apparently went on to say that the capture of Vuhledar would be key to continuing the liberation of the Donetsk People's Republic's territories, which are, of course, the same as the territories of Donetsk region, created by the Soviet Union and carried over into Ukraine. And since those reports appeared on DAS, there's also been another report from a Russian newspaper called Redovka. This is, I believe, based in Smolensk, by the way, but it's a website newspaper that covers events in the war quite closely and has quite a few reporters on the front lines. It also primarily is focused on Russian domestic news, and it's one of those websites and newspapers that actively supports the war. So again, take all this with a pinch of salt, but this is what Redovka says. Now, this is a machine translation, but it says that Russian troops have taken control of the highway leading from Pokrovsky to Vuhledar. On the outskirts of the city, they occupy new positions, and the source again is said to be Igor Kimakovsky, the same person who previously gave those comments to TASS. So we see that the Russians are claiming that they've made significant progress in Vuhledar. And that does make me wonder, by the way, whether the purpose of those Russian attacks further west in Zaporozhye region, in Orekhov, in Gulyapolye, and along the Dnieper River, might have been intended to pin down Ukrainian forces in Zaporozhye region, to distract Ukrainian forces and to provide some kind of support to this attack on Vuhledar, which for the moment the Russians seem fairly optimistic about capturing. They do accept that there's still a long battle, a long fight before Vuhledar is finally captured, but they do seem to think that this is now only a matter of time. So anyway, that's been the big dominant story about events on the battlefields in Ukraine over the last 24 hours. No doubt lots of fighting going on in all sorts of other places. The Russians continue to claim that there have been more attempts by Ukrainian special forces troops to try to cross the Dnieper River into Kherson region, Kherson region east of the Dnieper River. The Russians say that every one of those attacks has been repelled successfully, that lots of Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. The Russians even talk about these attacks as suicide attacks, which is pretty dramatic language. So that doesn't seem to be making much progress from the Ukrainian side. And there's also been more reports about fighting in the Svatovo, Kremenia, Kupiansk, Liman region of the battlefields. Quite heavy shelling by each side against the other. But overall, this area where it was clear that the Ukraine was at one point expecting or hoping to make big breakthroughs, that this part of the battlefield, at the moment, there is an effective stalemate. The big action is going on in Bakhmut, as it has been now for weeks and months, extending all the way back to August, and it looks as if Vuhledar is now becoming another main hotspot of the battle. And as I said previously, all this talk about Ukraine switching to mobile defense, as of now, there is absolutely no sign of it, and I'm starting to have serious doubts about whether that is possible. So that is the situation on the battlefields. Now, I want to again return briefly to the topic of the tank deliveries. And the first thing to say is that Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has done another outstanding video discussing these tank deliveries and the various problems that these tanks would face, these Western tanks will face when they finally reach Ukraine. And I'm not going to repeat what he says. You should go to the new Atlas and watch his video, because he deals with all of this in a masterly way. And by the way, he also gives a masterly discussion of the comments by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis about the problems, about the issues of operating the M1 Abrams tank in battle, which, we've discussed many times on these programs. And I ought to add, by the way, that others have also made their contributions. Colonel Douglas McGregor has also spoken about the enormous problems of operating the Abrams tank in Ukraine, and so has Scott Ritter. He's discussing the difficulties that Ukraine is going to have operating this huge hodgepodge of weapons that they seem to be getting from the West. Now, I do want to make, however, a number of further points. The first returns to a topic that I discussed yesterday, very heavily motivated by that brilliant article by the historian Jeff Roberts about the fact that what is now happening is that the Western leaders, perhaps sensing that a debacle is coming in Ukraine, don't want to be in a position where individually they're left to carry the blame for this. So Scholz didn't want to refuse the Leopard 2s, because when Ukraine is defeated, he didn't want to be the person who was blamed for the defeat because he didn't supply the Leopard 2s. And at the same time, presumably to shield himself from criticism from the Russians and from those people in Germany who oppose the supply of Leopard 2s to Ukraine, and that's a substantial number, by the way, and we've seen the German military is opposed. He also wanted to have the cover of the Americans agreeing to supply Leopard 2s to Ukraine. And we've now had a whole lot of comments and discussions about the American decision to provide 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. And I have to say that with every single article that I read, this tank delivery begins to sound increasingly, well, I'm not going to say that it's not going to happen, but it sounds rather more complicated. The story about it sounds rather more complicated than it first appears. The first thing to say about it is that the Russians have apparently given a very strong warning to the United States that if Ukraine is supplied with depleted uranium ammunition for its Abrams tanks and its Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the Russians would regard that as crossing a very serious red line indeed, that would be, from a Russian point of view, a use of what is approaching or has a connection to nuclear weapons, and that in that case the Russians will take strong action in response. I think that the United States will heed these warnings, and I think this is indeed going to something that isn't going to actually happen. But I've also been reading a whole lot of other articles in parts of the American media, and I've been trying to get a sense of the nature of this delivery, because it seems that these tanks are not going to be taken directly out of US Army stocks. The US Army operates over 2,000 of these tanks and has around 3,000 in store. But if the United States is indeed going to supply these tanks to Ukraine, as it said it will do, then it seems the plan at the moment is that they won't be these tanks that the United States, that the US Army has in its battle groups, in its units, or which it has in store. And there are reasons for this. Firstly, there's lots of secret electronic equipment in these tanks, and the United States doesn't want to have a situation where this equipment might fall into Russian hands. And then, as is the case with some criticisms that I've seen in Britain about the supply of the Challenger 2s, there's apparently also worries that the armour of the tanks, these American tanks, which uses some kind of uranium shielding. I haven't understood this. Those who are more expert in these matters, no doubt, do understand that the United States doesn't want the secrets of this armour to be compromised either. They don't want, in other words, the Russians to find out how this tank is protected, what its electronic systems are all about, if not only because the United States is worried about the uses that the Russians would put to this information, but because they're even more worried that the Russians would share all that information with the Chinese, who are, of course, the country that the United States is most nervous about. So it seems that the tanks that Ukraine is going to get are going to be, shall we say, tanks of a lesser capability, a significantly lesser capability than those which the US Army itself uses. They're going to be, in other words, export models. Now, there are some issues here because I think it's fair to say that production of these tanks does still continue, though on a fairly limited basis. The United States re-equipped its forces with these tanks some time ago and has no special need to keep this tank in production to equip its own army. But limited construction of this tank does take place to provide tanks for export customers. And also, of course, the tank plant, the Lima tank plant, does regularly refurbish and modernize US tanks. But I suppose one option would be to take US tanks out of store, send them to this plant, replace the old armor, the American, the armor the Americans use with sort of lesser strong armor, armor suited for export models. I don't know how complex an operation that would be, but I'm going to guess it would be quite a complex operation indeed and might take several months to do, at least. Another possibility might be to see whether one of the countries to which the United States has supplied this tank might be willing to return some of these tanks to the United States, 31 of them. In other words, the United States might be prepared to buy these tanks from one of these export customers and then resell these tanks or supply these tanks to Ukraine. In other words, they would be tanks used by another country. Now, there are several countries, apart from the United States, that do operate this tank. And I'm assuming that they all use export versions of this tank, tanks that don't have this special armor that the Americans have and don't have the special electronic equipment that the United States Army uses with this tank. Now, which countries might it be? Well, I went through the list of countries that do operate this tank, and it seems, perhaps unsurprisingly, that most of them are in the Middle East. So Saudi Arabia has a significant number. Iraq also has some. Egypt has rather a lot, and so does Morocco. Now, which of these countries might be prepared to supply tanks of this kind, sell them back to the United States for re-export to Ukraine. Well, I think Egypt is extremely unlikely to agree to this. Egypt has very good relations with Russia. President Sisi of Egypt has a strong personal relationship with President Putin. And perhaps most important of all, Russia is Egypt's major supplier of wheat and flour, which is essential for not just for the feeding Egypt's population, but for maintaining social stability in Egypt. Egypt is going through an economic crisis. There's very high inflation there. The very last thing I would have thought the President Sisi would want to do, especially given the way in which he came to power through a military coup, is to complicate his situation in Egypt by seeing food prices rise even further, by potentially getting himself into an argument with his main supplier of wheat and food products. So I can't really see Egypt supplying these tanks. What about Saudi Arabia? Well, Saudi Arabia has its own problems, which is that it is, of course, fighting in Yemen, so it presumably needs its tanks to maintain its position in the war there. And besides, it too has been gradually coming closer to Russia. And of course, it now has ambitions to join the BRICS. So again, I have to say, I think it's unlikely that Saudi Arabia would be willing to supply its tanks, return its tanks to the United States so that they could be sent to Ukraine. Iraq? Well, possible. But of course, Iraq has its problems of its own. It's got lots of other problems. And I can't again really see Iraq being a country that would want to do a thing like this. Iranian influence in Iraq is very strong. Iran is allied to Russia. Russia itself has good relations with Iraq, and Iraq has lots of domestic issues, to put it mildly. And I can't really see, as I said, that the Iraqis would be happy to part with their tanks. And, well, there's two other countries left, Morocco and Kuwait. Now, Morocco is an interesting point because Morocco does operate some of these tanks. And by the way, they've been delivered to Morocco fairly recently. And so these presumably are tanks in reasonably good condition. And Morocco might be willing to return, in theory, might be willing to return some of these tanks to the United States so that they could be re-exported to Ukraine. But I'm not sure that they would agree. And there's been a rather curious intrigue about Morocco because over the last couple of weeks there have been reports that Morocco agreed to supply Russian T-72s, which had been supplied to Morocco, that he'd agreed to supply those to Ukraine. But recently I saw a report that the government of Morocco has strongly disputed this. According to this report, and I haven't seen the original statement from the Moroccan government, but I suspect that this report is true. What actually happened was that Morocco sent its T-72s to the Czech Republic for modernization and refurbishment. And whilst these T-72s, about 20 of them, were in the Czech Republic, they were impounded by the Czech authorities, who then transferred them to Ukraine without seeking Morocco's agreement or permission first. And the Moroccans have apparently complained about this, and they're apparently quite angry. And I would say that Morocco has historically had, well, perhaps not always good relations with Russia, but the country the two countries don't consider themselves hostile to each other. Now, if this episode is correct, if this is what has actually happened, then I would have thought that it would make the Moroccans less willing to part with their American tanks. And I would add something else, that if this story about Morocco giving its tanks to the Czechs to refurbish and then the Czechs simply impounding them and forwarding them on to Ukraine is intended to give Morocco some kind of political cover. It's been publicized in order for the Moroccans to come along to the Russians and say, well, actually, it wasn't us. Blame the Czechs for this sort of thing. This was not what we intended or expected to do. Well, obviously, if that's what this is all about, if Morocco were to agree to supply some of its Abrams tanks ultimately to Ukraine, well, they would not be able to hide behind that kind of device. So I don't know whether Morocco would agree to do that. I think it unlikely, to be honest. Well, that just leaves Kuwait, and Kuwait does have quite a few of these tanks, but again, to my knowledge, it's got reasonably good relations with Russia. I don't know whether or not the Kuwaitis would be prepared to annoy the Russians by agreeing to this proposal, but perhaps they would be, and I wouldn't say that it was a guaranteed thing. So, if none of these Middle East countries are prepared to make their tanks available for re-export to Ukraine, we come back to what I said. Either the Americans, if they are indeed going to take away all these important secret elements out of these tanks, the armor and the electronic systems, well, it seems to me that they have only one of two choices. Either they take some of their own tanks out of store and have the Lima factory refurbish them, or they get the Lima factory to manufacture 31 new tanks. Now, I'm not going to try and speculate how complex an exercise that would be, either of those things would be, but it would certainly, I would have thought, take months, even if these tanks, the Arab states, one of these Arab states was prepared to return some of these tanks to the United States. The United States would presumably have to check to see what kind of condition these tanks were in. It's clear that this whole operation is going to take quite a few months. And I saw a report that it might be even a year before these tanks were finally handed over to Ukraine. And one can begin to see what the problems might be. And that does, again, beg the question about the whole purpose of this whole exercise. Scholz wanted American cover to send these tanks to Ukraine and to send Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. And he's got it. But what he hasn't actually got is American tanks being ferried to Ukraine. He's got a long-term commitment for that to happen, but that commitment might be a very long time indeed. And there's been a rather interesting comment about this from, of all people, Con Coughlin, who is a journalist who writes for the Daily Telegraph and who incidentally takes an extremely anti-Russian position on just about everything. But he does make the point that US officials seem more interested in explaining the difficulties involved in providing the Abrams, warning that they are complex weapon systems that are challenging to maintain, then focusing on their delivery schedule, which it has been estimated could take more than a couple of months. That would be too late. That's Con Coughlin's view. So it may be that we are looking at a delivery for the far future, not one that's going to materialize anytime soon on the battlefields. Now, what about the Leopard 2s? It now seems that we're looking at a total force here that, well, Scholz said it would be 2 battalions, and it's apparently going to be something like 80 to 88 of these tanks, which is rather less than some of the earlier reports had said. I don't know where, by the way, the 14 British Challenger 2 tanks fit into this picture. As I said, this is going to complicate logistics even further, having these Challenger 2s. But anyway, 88 Leopard 2 tanks in this vast battlefield with hundreds of thousands of men involved. Now, I'm not going to repeat all the points that Brian Beletic has been making about this, the complexities of operating these tanks. But we have had articles that talk about the difficulties of operating these Western tanks, and they're now starting to appear in the mainstream British media. There's a very interesting article by Dominic Nichols in the Daily Telegraph about as mainstream a newspaper in Britain as it gets. And it says, tanks cannot take enemy positions and hold ground on their own. For that, battlefield commanders need other parts of the military orchestra to be all in tune. This is a point, by the way, that Brian Beletic makes repeatedly. They only work as part of combined arms war. And then he says, first infantry, at least in vehicles capable of withstanding anything up to a direct hit by artillery or anti-tank weapons, and preferably in specially designed fighting vehicles able to blast enemy positions as they close the critical last few hundred meters. By the way, I don't know what Nichols is talking about, because to my knowledge, armored vehicles, infantry vehicles, that are impervious to direct hits by artillery and anti-tank weapons simply don't exist. That's one thing I've learned from this war, and I don't know where he thinks that such systems, such weapons exist, but they don't in fact exist in reality. And then he then goes on to say, then engineering assets to breach minefields or to get the force across rivers that have had their bridges blown up. Or indeed, I would add, use Ukrainian bridges, which may not be up to the strength of carrying these 70-ton plus tanks that the West is supplying. Then it goes on to, next, artillery to cover the flanks and depth targets, preventing the enemy from counterattacking. But we read in Reuters a few days ago that a US official has already told Ukraine that the United States has given up, effectively, essentially given up, trying to match the Russians in artillery. So the Russians are always going to have enormous advantages in artillery. Then it goes on to say the whole performance also needs an umbrella of air defense to stop Russian jets and helicopters interfering. What air defense? We see the problems Ukraine has already with its air defense assets, how these are being withered away, wasted away by the Russians, and how there is an increasing lack of systems that the United States and its allies can send to Ukraine to provide air defense. Then it goes on to say, prior to all this, low loaders will be required to get the tanks as close to the front as possible. Tanks rarely travel under their own steam, as increased track mileage adds wear and tear to an already taut maintenance chain, meaning that low loaders, long wheeled-based trucks are required. They need protecting too. Now, I just want to say something here about comments that both Brian Beletic in his latest video has made, and which Daniel Davis made in that article in 1945, about that in tank warfare, the person who spots, who fires first and hits the target first, almost invariably wins. Now, one of the great problems that Ukraine is going to face if it operates these tanks is that, in complete contrast to the situation in Iraq in 1991 and 2003, when the Iraqi military essentially had no surveillance systems operating, the Russians have huge numbers of surveillance systems over the Ukrainian battlefields. In particular, they have now large numbers of surveillance drones, and they are about to produce many, many, many more of them. It's going to be very, very difficult indeed to conceal a 70-ton tank on the battlefields from, these large numbers of drones that there are. And of course, if you're going to have convoys of these tanks lumbering across the battlefields in these huge long-wheeled based trucks along metalled roads, well, the chances, frankly, of concealing their presence from, this huge Russian drone fleet and all the other surveillance tools that the Russians have, I would have thought that was hopeless. And then Nichols goes on to say, of course, when operating very capable Western tanks, the correct response is, yes, please, even if their logistic tales are largely bespoke and intricate. But then he goes on to say that donations of weapons from multiple sources, throw up their own set of problems. In the medium term, Ukraine is likely to slim down to an all-Leopard fleet, Leopard 2s, but perhaps even Leopard 1s. I can't imagine why they would want Leopard 1s, by the way. Everybody agrees that those are obsolete tanks, but anyway, that's what Nichols says. And he then goes on to say, Kiev finds itself now in a similar position to Britain, circa 2006. I have to say, I find that a difficult concept to understand. But anyway, this is what it goes on to say. When military and political chiefs in London realized that the kit they had deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan was not up to the job, so started a colossal and expensive process of rapidly bringing into service urgent operational requirements to plug the immediate gap. The resulting equipment was generally very good, but hampered by being designed to solve only one problem. And then he talks about the enormously complicated logistics that this all created and the enormous costs of doing it, and how all of this was a massive challenge for the British to resolve, and how and it cost huge amounts of money. And he then goes on to say, for now, Ukrainian troops and civilians will have to rely on their ability to be adept at battlefield innovation. However, they will need to do even more, patching up on a systemic industrial scale to meet this challenge. They may need to shift to something approaching a war economy at great cost to their domestic industrial output. They may need a newly built maintenance and production facility to make it all work in the long term, perhaps in Poland. I don't know what this person, Dominic Nichols, is talking about. I mean, if this was a challenge which this British in peacetime struggled to master, Ukraine, with an economy that is contracting by a third, according to official figures, and whose industry is practically on its back, no way that they're going to be able to do this. Maybe the Western powers can sort out some of these problems and establishing these industrial scale things in places like Poland, but that's going to cost a huge amount of money. It's going to take a very, very long time to do. Does Ukraine have this time? And he then goes on to ask, how does this, and he then goes on to say, but this is just a delivery service, extra time and locations outside the country will be needed to train the crews and maintainers. How does this fit with Ukraine's operational plans and the anticipated Russian spring offensive, even if the latter relies largely on undertrained and equipped troops? They're still expected to number in their tens of thousands. Well, the answer is it doesn't. So many logistic, industrial, political, societal and operational hurdles to overcome. And he then goes on to admit an armoured attack needs many different moving parts to work together as a seamless, coordinated, lethal machine. There are countless reasons why an armoured thrust by Ukraine could be absorbed and even repelled by Russia. Well, as I said, I'm going to say it straight away. The solutions to these problems that he's talking about are fanciful. They're simply not going to happen. It simply isn't going to be an option to set up all of these systems. So we come back to this underlying question, why supply these tanks at all? Now, Alex Christopher and I had a long discussion on one of our recent videos in which we said that we discussed the possibility that all of these tanks, what they're going to do is they're going to end up in Poland. When the collapse in Ukraine eventually comes, they'll be pressed into this Polish expeditionary force which is being prepared and which is going to be intended to occupy Western Ukraine. And I have to say, I do think this is a real possibility. But I am coming to the view that even though that is a possibility and one that is unspoken, perhaps at the back of some people's minds, I doubt that it is actually the plan. I think that there is no plan, to say it very straightforwardly. I think that the politicians almost certainly have been told about all of these immense problems. But as I said previously, as Jeff Roberts has said, perhaps more effectively than I have done, what's really happening is that politicians like Scholz, Biden, Macron to some extent, are all minding their backs. They don't want to be blamed for the debacle. And so they're sending these tanks to Ukraine in the hope that that will get the critics off their backs. I think that is all it is. There is one further possibility about the ABRAMS deliveries, which I'm going to discuss in my next program, based on a very interesting article by John Helmer, which, as I say, I'm going to discuss extensively in the next program. And that is that the American plan is really for these tanks, these American tanks, to go into a Ukrainian army that's going to be built up after the war has ended. But I'm not going to go into that in this program. All I will say is that to send tanks like this into battle without any real operational plan for them is, well, I would say straightforwardly, I think it's criminal. I think it's one of the worst decisions I have ever seen. It's a decision based on political cowardice, and moreover, it's not going to work. Already we see the hardliners manoeuvring. We can, I think, disregard Annalena Baerbock's, frankly, astonishing comments in Germany about how Europe is at war with Russia. I think Baerbock, as is often the case, was talking in this overblown way, and I don't think she was really talking about a war with Russia. She was trying to explain why unity within the EU is so important. But again, it shows the shrill, these comments do show the shrill and hysterical atmosphere in which decisions are being made. But the point is, the key thing to understand is that these tank deliveries are not going to appease the hardliners. Already there is talk about moving on to supplying ATACMS missiles. F-16 fighter jets. Politico says that there's even now talk about doing this. It might even be discussed in Ramstein, though the majority of NATO leaders are apparently, for the moment, still opposed to the idea. The point is that this issue of the F-16s is now on the agenda. And given that it is on the agenda, we can be certain that at some point it's going to materialize. What is that going to achieve? Well, we've seen the problems the Russians are having operating their air force in Ukraine, despite the very fragile air defenses that Ukraine has. But they're still more sophisticated than anything that the West has come up against in any of the many wars it has fought. What chance do F-16s have against the Russian air defense system, which is so much more powerful and so much more effective than the Ukrainian? What's going to happen is that these F-16s, if they're ever deployed, it'll mark a further massive escalation. They won't change the war. And if they start to be deployed in any numbers, they're going to be shot out of the skies, calling for more demands, for more escalation. As I said already, as Jeff Roberts said, we are now on an escalation escalator. We are moving upwards. Western leaders don't know how to get off. And with this foolish decision about sending tanks, they've got themselves, and they've gone up this escalator another rung, and it's going to create for them even more problems in the future. Weak decisions lead to bad outcomes, and this is one of the weakest and worst decisions any government has made, which I can remember. Well, thank you for bearing with me. I hope this is going to be the last program for a while in which I'm going to discuss tanks, a topic which I've learnt more about in the last few weeks than I've ever known about in all my previous years. And thank you, by the way, to the many people who've written to me all kinds of useful information about this topic. Anyway, this is where I finish. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also check out our shop if you wish and buy yourself the great merchandise that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.